Where are you watching this mystery from? Tell us your country in the comments. If you enjoyed the mystery, subscribe for more Miss Marple cases and unforgettable twists. Chapter 1. The Funeral. The funeral of Mrs. Eleanor Wycliffe should have been a quiet affair. In St. Mary Mead, however, nothing involving the Wycliffe family had ever been entirely quiet. By 11 o'clock that Thursday morning, the little churchyard was crowded with villagers in dark coats, sensible shoes, and expressions of solemn importance. Rain had fallen during the night, leaving the gravestones damp and the narrow paths shining beneath a pale October sun. Inside the church, the organ played softly. Outside, people whispered. "She had no business dying so suddenly," murmured Mrs. Lavinia Bell, tightening her gloves. "She was 78, replied her companion. "That proves nothing." Mrs. Bell lowered her voice. "I heard there was an argument the evening before." "With whom?" "That is precisely what nobody seems willing to say." Across the churchyard, Miss Marple stood beneath a black umbrella. She appeared, as usual, to be paying very little attention to anything. In reality, she had already noticed that 3 people were avoiding one another. That was often more revealing than anything they might have said. The Wycliffe family occupied the front pew. There was Arthur Wycliffe, Eleanor's eldest son, whose face looked stiff with grief, or perhaps with irritation. Beside him sat his younger sister, Margaret, pale and trembling. At the end of the pew was Daniel Wycliffe, Eleanor's grandson. He had arrived from London only that morning, or so everyone believed. Miss Marple glanced at him once, then twice. Something about the young man's expression troubled her. Not because he looked guilty. He did not. He looked frightened. The vicar began the service. The church fell silent. For nearly 40 minutes, nothing unusual happened. Then, just as the coffin was being carried toward the churchyard, Miss Marple noticed a man standing near the rear entrance. He was a stranger, tall, gray-haired, wearing an old-fashioned black coat. He stood perfectly still, watching the family. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody seemed to know him. And yet, when Arthur Wycliffe turned and saw the stranger, the color drained from his face. Miss Marple saw that too. She lowered her eyes immediately. A moment later, the stranger disappeared through the side door. The funeral continued, but 5 minutes later, something happened that made even Miss Marple's expression change. The coffin had been lowered into the grave. The mourners gathered around. The vicar began his final prayer. Then a woman screamed. Everyone turned. Mrs. Bell was staring toward the path leading from the church gate. "There!" she cried. A man was walking slowly toward them, the same gray-haired stranger. He removed his hat and smiled. Arthur Wycliffe staggered backward. "You!" he whispered. The stranger looked directly at him. "I believe," he said calmly, "that I have every right to be here." Silence fell over the churchyard. Margaret Wycliffe covered her mouth. Daniel stared at the man as though he had seen a ghost. Miss Marple watched all 3 reactions carefully. The vicar cleared his throat. "Sir, may I ask who you are?" The stranger's smile disappeared. "My name," he said, "is Edward Wycliffe." There was a collective gasp. Arthur shook his head. "That is impossible." The stranger looked toward the freshly covered grave. "No," he replied quietly. "What is impossible is that my wife has just been buried." Nobody moved. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her umbrella, because she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Eleanor Wycliffe had been a widow for 23 years, and yet the man standing beside her grave had just claimed to be her husband. More disturbing still, he had not come to mourn her. He had come to find out who had killed her. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. For several seconds after Edward Wycliffe spoke, nobody in the churchyard seemed capable of moving. The October wind stirred the bare branches above them, scattering a handful of yellow leaves across the freshly turned earth. Then everyone began speaking at once. "Edward Wycliffe? That can't be possible." But Arthur said, "I thought Eleanor was widowed. Who is that man?" The vicar raised both hands, attempting to restore order, but the effort was hopeless. Miss Marple remained where she was. She had learned long ago that the first few minutes after a shocking revelation were often more valuable than an entire afternoon of questioning. People spoke without thinking. Faces revealed what mouths attempted to conceal. And at that moment, Arthur Wycliffe's face was revealing rather too much. "You cannot possibly be Edward," he said. The stranger regarded him calmly. "And why not?" "Because my father died." "When?" Arthur hesitated. 23 years ago." Edward gave a faint, humorless smile. "Did he?" The question fell heavily over the group. Margaret suddenly stepped forward. "Please," she whispered, "not here." Edward looked at her. For the first time his expression softened. "I'm sorry, Margaret." She went completely still. He knew her name. That fact alone was enough to send another wave of whispers through the churchyard. Mrs. Bell immediately leaned toward her neighbor. "I told you there was something strange about that family." Her neighbor frowned. "You said the same thing about the butcher last Tuesday." "And I was right about him, too." Miss Marple almost smiled. Almost. The vicar approached Edward carefully. "Sir, perhaps we should go somewhere private." "No," said Edward. His eyes moved toward the grave. "I think everyone should hear what I have to say." Arthur's jaw tightened. "You have no right to disturb my mother's funeral." Edward turned toward him. "Your mother?" There was something in the way he said the words that made several people glance at one another. "She was my wife." Arthur's face hardened. "She left you." "I know. You disappeared. I know that too. You were declared dead." Edward looked down at the grave, and apparently that was convenient for quite a few people. A murmur passed through the crowd. Miss Marple noticed something then. Daniel Wycliffe had stepped away from the others. He was standing near an old stone angel, his hands buried in his coat pockets. He was not watching Edward. He was watching Arthur. That was interesting. Miss Marple shifted her umbrella slightly and studied the young man. Daniel looked troubled, but not surprised. There was a difference. a very important difference. The police arrived 10 minutes later. Inspector Harold Crane had been stationed in the neighboring district and was not particularly pleased to find himself standing in a muddy churchyard surrounded by excited villagers. He listened to Edward's story without interrupting. "You say you are Edward Wycliffe?" "Yes." "And you have been absent for 23 years?" "Yes." "Where have you been?" Edward's expression became guarded. "That is a long story." Inspector Crane sighed. "I suspect it is, and I will tell it," Edward replied. "But not here." Crane glanced at the assembled villagers. "Agreed." His eyes then moved toward the grave. "You also said Mrs. Wycliffe was murdered." "I did." "Why?" "Because she was afraid." Crane frowned. "Afraid of what?" Edward looked at Arthur. Arthur looked away. Miss Marple noticed. Edward continued, "My wife sent me a letter 3 days ago." Margaret gasped. "A letter?" Edward nodded. "She told me that someone had discovered the truth about what happened 23 years ago." Arthur suddenly stepped forward. "Enough." Inspector Crane immediately turned toward him. "Mr. Wycliffe, my mother is dead. Whatever family arguments you imagine existed—" "I don't imagine them," Edward interrupted quietly. "I remember them." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Then Edward reached inside his coat. Every eye followed the movement. He removed a folded envelope. "I received this from Eleanor." Crane held out his hand. Edward did not give it to him. "Before she died," he said, "she wrote that if anything happened to her, I was to return to St. Mary Mead." "And?" Edward looked toward the grave. "I did." Inspector Crane's expression became serious. "When did you arrive?" "This morning." "Before the funeral?" "Yes." "Did you see Mrs. Wycliffe before she was buried?" "No." "Did you know she was dead?" "I knew she was ill." "Who told you?" Edward paused. "No one." Crane narrowed his eyes. "Then how did you know?" Edward looked directly at him. "Because the letter told me." That answer seemed to satisfy nobody, especially not Miss Marple. The villagers began drifting away, but none of them truly wanted to leave. By lunchtime, the story had already changed shape. At the post office, Mrs. Bell declared that Edward Wycliffe had returned from South America. At the butcher's shop, someone insisted he had been hiding in Scotland. By 2 o'clock, a third version claimed that he had been in prison. By 3, there was even a rumor that Eleanor Wycliffe had secretly married him twice. St. Mary Mead was extraordinarily efficient at producing facts. Unfortunately, they were rarely accurate. Miss Marple listened to several versions that afternoon while sitting in the corner of the Bluebell tea room. She had ordered tea and a small slice of sponge cake. Across from her sat Inspector Crane. "I suppose you've heard everything," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, not everything. Enough, though. Enough to know that everyone is frightened." Crane stirred his tea. "I'm more interested in why." Miss Marple looked toward the window. Outside, 2 women were whispering beside a bicycle. "People are frightened for different reasons, Inspector." "Such as?" Some fear the truth, and others, some fear that the truth will be blamed on them. Crane looked at her thoughtfully. You think someone in this village knows what happened to Mrs. Wycliffe? I think, said Miss Marple gently, that quite a number of people know something. That's not very helpful. No, she took a sip of tea, but it is usually how these things begin. Inspector Crane leaned forward. Do you believe Edward Wycliffe? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She remembered the man's face when he had looked at Eleanor's grave. There had been grief, but there had also been something else. Regret, perhaps, or guilt, yet Miss Marple was not prepared to decide which. I believe he knew Mrs. Wycliffe very well, she said at last. Crane frowned. That wasn't my question. No, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, but it is the answer I have. At that moment, the door of the tea-room opened. Daniel Wycliffe entered. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple. For a second, his expression suggested he might leave. Instead, he walked toward their table. Miss Marple, he said quietly. She smiled. Daniel, may I speak with you? Inspector Crane stood. I'll give you a moment. Daniel sat down. His hands were shaking. I don't know what my grandfather wants. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Do you mean Edward? Daniel nodded. He wasn't supposed to come back. The words were spoken so softly that they almost disappeared beneath the sound of rain beginning against the windows. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Why wasn't he? Daniel looked toward the door. Then he whispered, Because my grandmother was terrified of him. Miss Marple said nothing. Daniel swallowed. And yesterday evening, she told me something I have not been able to forget. What did she tell you? Daniel stared at his hands. She said that if Edward ever returned, he stopped. Miss Marple waited. Daniel finally looked up. She would not be the only person in this village with something to fear. Outside, the rain grew heavier, and somewhere beyond the tea-room, a church bell began to ring. 1, 2, 3. Miss Marple listened. There was something strangely familiar about the pattern. She could not yet say why, but she was certain of one thing. Eleanor Wycliffe's death had not begun with her funeral. It had begun 23 years earlier, and someone in St. Mary Mead had been waiting ever since for the past to remain buried. Chapter 3. The First Suspect. The church bell stopped ringing at precisely 4:30. Miss Marple remained seated in the Bluebell tea-room for several minutes after Daniel Wycliffe had left. She had not touched her tea. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady drizzle, blurring the village street behind a veil of gray. People hurried beneath umbrellas, but their movements lacked purpose. They were not going home. They were going somewhere to talk. That was the way of villages. A murder might happen in a city and become a newspaper story. In St. Mary Mead, it became a community project. Inspector Crane returned to the table. Daniel has gone. Yes, he says his grandmother was frightened of Edward. So he does. Crane pulled out a notebook. There is something else. Miss Marple looked at him. We searched Mrs. Wycliffe's house. And? We found a letter. Miss Marple's expression remained composed. From Edward? No, Crane lowered his voice. From someone else. He opened the notebook. The letter was hidden inside a sewing box in Mrs. Wycliffe's bedroom. No name, no signature, just 4 lines. What did it say? Crane glanced toward the window before answering. You should have told him the truth. He has come back because of you. If you speak now, you will lose everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. That sounds rather threatening. I thought so too. Was the letter recent? Possibly. The paper is new, but that tells us very little. And Mrs. Wycliffe kept it? Apparently. Miss Marple folded her hands. Did she keep other letters? Dozens. Then this one wasn't necessarily important because of its contents. Crane looked puzzled. Why else would she keep it? Because she wanted to remember who sent it. The inspector considered that. Then his expression changed. That means she knew the writer. It seems likely. Crane closed the notebook. And there is another problem. Miss Marple waited. The police surgeon has examined the circumstances surrounding her death. Her gaze sharpened. What has he found? Mrs. Wycliffe did not die of natural causes. For the first time, Miss Marple's face became grave. Poison? We don't know yet. Then what do you know? She had taken her usual evening tea. Nothing unusual there, but she collapsed shortly afterward. Who prepared it? Her housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. Miss Marple remembered the woman. Quiet, thin, middle-aged, the sort of person who could move through a household without being noticed. Does Mrs. Finch have a motive? Crane gave a tired smile. Everyone has a motive in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is often the difficulty. The next morning, the village woke to another shock. Mrs. Finch had disappeared. She had not reported for work. Her small cottage behind the Wycliffe property was empty. The bed had not been slept in. A cup of tea stood untouched beside the kitchen window. Inspector Crane was not pleased. By 9 o'clock, 2 constables were searching the lanes around the village. By 10, the villagers had reached a conclusion. Mrs. Finch had run away. By 11, they had decided she had done so because she was guilty. Miss Marple heard the theory from 3 different people before luncheon. Each version became more elaborate. Mrs. Bell claimed Mrs. Finch had been secretly in love with Arthur Wycliffe. The postmistress insisted she had seen Mrs. Finch arguing with Eleanor. The butcher's wife maintained that Mrs. Finch had once stolen silver spoons from another employer. None of these stories had any reliable foundation. But Miss Marple was interested in one thing. Nobody mentioned that Mrs. Finch had worked for Eleanor Wycliffe for 16 years. That was a long time, long enough to know every habit in the house, every cupboard, every private quarrel, every family secret. Miss Marple decided to visit the Wycliffe house. Arthur received her in the drawing room. He looked exhausted. I don't know why you're here, Miss Marple. To pay my respects. My mother's funeral was yesterday. Yes. He stared at her. Then you have already paid them. Miss Marple smiled gently. I thought perhaps you might need some company." Arthur looked almost offended. "I don't." "No," she said. "I imagine you don't." There was a silence. Miss Marple glanced around the room. The furniture was expensive but old-fashioned. A silver clock stood upon the mantelpiece. Beside it was a framed photograph of Eleanor Wycliffe as a young woman. She was standing beside a tall man. Miss Marple moved closer. "Is that Edward?" Arthur's face tightened. "Yes." How handsome he was. He was charming. The way Arthur spoke the word made it sound like an accusation. "And were they happy?" Arthur looked at the photograph. For a time. Miss Marple waited. Then he became impossible. "In what way?" Arthur turned away. "He drank? Was he violent?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. "He was simply unreliable," Arthur continued. "He disappeared for days. He owed money. Eventually he left. And your mother? She stayed. Did she divorce him?" "No. Why not?" Arthur's eyes hardened. "Because she never stopped believing he might return." Miss Marple looked again at the photograph. Perhaps he did. Arthur gave a bitter laugh. 23 years later. Yes? There was another silence. Then Miss Marple noticed something on the mantelpiece. A small brass key. It was old and slightly tarnished. "What does that open?" Arthur followed her gaze. "Nothing." "Nothing?" "It belonged to my mother." Miss Marple smiled. "Then it probably opened something." Arthur picked it up. "She kept it for sentimental reasons." "Was she sentimental?" "No." His answer was immediate. Miss Marple said nothing more. A moment later, Margaret entered the room. She looked startled to see Miss Marple. "Arthur, Inspector Crane is outside." "Why?" "He wants to speak to you." Arthur's face changed. "About what?" Margaret hesitated. "Mrs. Finch." Arthur stood. "I'll deal with it." As he passed Miss Marple, she noticed that his right hand was trembling. Only slightly, but enough. Later that afternoon, Inspector Crane told Miss Marple what had happened. Arthur had been questioned about Mrs. Finch. Then Daniel had been questioned. And finally Margaret. "Why?" Miss Marple asked. "Because Mrs. Finch wasn't the only person who disappeared." "Who else?" Crane looked uncomfortable. "Daniel." Miss Marple frowned. "When?" "About an hour ago." "Where was he going?" "No one knows." "And Arthur?" "He says Daniel left voluntarily." "Do you believe him?" Crane sighed. "I don't know what to believe." Miss Marple looked toward the churchyard. The rain had stopped. A thin shaft of sunlight fell across the wet gravestones. "Inspector," she said quietly, "what was the first thing Daniel said yesterday?" Crane thought. "He said he didn't know what his grandfather wanted." "No." Miss Marple shook her head. Before that, Crane searched his memory. Then he remembered. He said his grandfather wasn't supposed to come back. "Exactly." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. But Daniel did not ask why his grandfather had returned. Crane stared at her. He already knew. Miss Marple nodded, and that makes him much more interesting than he appears. At that moment, A constable came running across the churchyard. "Inspector!" Crane turned. "What is it?" "We found something near the old boathouse." The constable held out a small object wrapped in cloth. A man's watch. The glass was cracked. The hands had stopped at exactly 9:17. Crane examined it carefully. "Where did you find this?" "In the mud beside the river." Miss Marple looked at the watch, then at the constable. "Was there anything else?" "Yes." He swallowed. "A footprint." "Whose?" "We don't know." Miss Marple looked toward the distant river. The expression on her face remained calm, but something had changed, because she suddenly remembered the stranger at the funeral. Edward Wycliffe had said he came to St. Mary Mead to discover who had killed his wife. Yet someone had clearly been expecting him. And now a man's watch had been found beside the river. Miss Marple quietly adjusted her gloves. "Inspector," she said, "I think you should ask Edward Wycliffe where he was at 9:17 last night." Crane looked at her. "Why?" Miss Marple glanced once more at the stopped watch. "Because," she said softly, "I have a feeling someone has just made a very careless mistake." Chapter 4. The Man by the River. Inspector Crane found Edward Wycliffe in the small sitting room of the Crown Hotel. He was standing beside the window, looking toward the village as though he expected someone to appear. When Crane entered, Edward turned. "You found something." It was not a question. Crane closed the door behind him. A man's watch. Edward's expression changed very slightly. "Where?" "Near the river." "Whose?" Now generate Chapter 4 of the story, ensuring smooth continuity from the previous section. Maintain the same pacing, character development, and mystery buildup without premature reveals. Keep the word count consistent, progressing the narrative naturally while leading into the next section. Make sure each sec is named chapter, and also keep the word count between 1,000 to 1,200 words. We don't know. Crane watched him carefully. The hands had stopped at 9:17. Edward said nothing. Miss Marple, who had followed the inspector into the room, noticed that Edward's eyes moved toward the clock on the mantelpiece. Only for an instant, but they moved. "Where were you last night at 9:17? Crane asked. Edward looked at him. "In my hotel room." "Alone?" "Yes." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No." Crane took out his notebook. "You arrived in St. Mary Mead yesterday morning." "Yes." "You attended your wife's funeral." "Yes." "You claim she sent you a letter asking you to return." "Yes." "And now a watch belonging to an unidentified man has been found beside the river." Edward's face remained expressionless. "I don't see what that has to do with me." "Neither do I," said Crane. "That's why I'm asking." Edward turned toward Miss Marple. "You believe I killed Eleanor?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I don't believe anything yet." "Then you're wiser than most people here." Edward's voice contained bitterness. "By this morning, half the village had decided I murdered my wife." "Villages are very efficient," Miss Marple observed. Edward gave a short laugh. "That is one word for it." Crane stepped closer. "Did you know Mrs. Finch?" Edward's expression became guarded. "Yes." "How well?" She worked for Eleanor. That isn't what I asked. Edward looked away. I knew her. Did you meet her yesterday? No? Are you certain? Yes? Miss Marple noticed his answer was slower this time. Not much slower. Just enough. Before Crane could continue, there was a knock at the door. A constable entered. Inspector, we've received word from the Wycliffe house. What now? Mr. Arthur Wycliffe has asked for you. Crane frowned. Why? He says he has found something in his mother's bedroom. Edward suddenly turned. What? The constable looked at him. I don't know, sir. Crane gestured toward the door. Let's go. Edward moved to follow. Crane stopped him. You stay here. Edward's eyes hardened. You're investigating my wife's death. Yes. Then I have a right to know what you've found. You'll know when I decide you should. Edward stared at him, then slowly sat down. Miss Marple remained behind for another moment. She looked at Edward. Mr. Wycliffe. Yes? Did your wife ever tell you what happened on the night you disappeared? Edward's face became strangely still. No. Not even in her letter? No. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you. She followed Crane out. They walked in silence toward the Wycliffe house. The village appeared unusually quiet. Even the usual afternoon gossip had stopped. At the gate, Miss Marple noticed a bicycle lying against the hedge. A woman's bicycle. The basket was empty. Mrs. Finch? She asked. Crane shook his head. No, that's Margaret's. Miss Marple looked at it. One of the wheels is muddy. It rained last night. Yes, but the front wheel is clean. Crane stopped. Miss Marple pointed. Someone has moved it recently. Crane stared at the bicycle, then at her. Do you think Margaret rode somewhere last night? I don't know. That sounded like a yes. Miss Marple smiled. It was only an observation. Inside the house, Arthur was waiting in the hallway. His face looked pale. What have you found? Crane asked. Arthur glanced toward Miss Marple. Something my mother hid. He led them upstairs. The bedroom remained exactly as Eleanor had left it. A half-finished embroidery lay beside the chair. A pair of spectacles rested on the table. The room smelled faintly of lavender. Arthur walked to the wardrobe. My mother kept a locked drawer here. He pulled open the drawer. It was empty. Crane frowned. You said you found something. I found this underneath it. Arthur reached beneath the wooden frame and removed a small envelope. There was no name on it. Miss Marple looked at the envelope. May I? Arthur hesitated, then handed it to her. Inside was a photograph. Miss Marple held it beneath the light. It showed Eleanor Wycliffe standing beside 3 people, Arthur, Margaret, and a much younger man, Daniel. But there was something strange. On the back, someone had written a date, October 14th, 2003. And beneath it were 4 words. One of them knows. Crane stared at the message. Who wrote that? Arthur shook his head. I don't know. Miss Marple looked carefully at the photograph. Do you remember this day? Arthur nodded. It was my mother's birthday. Who took the photograph? I don't remember. Was Edward here? No. Miss Marple turned the photograph over again. What happened on October 14th? Nothing, Arthur answered too quickly. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Arthur, he turned. You shouldn't be here. She looked frightened. I heard voices. Crane held up the photograph. Do you recognize this? Margaret's face changed. She took one step backward. Yes. Who wrote the message? I don't know. Are you sure? Margaret looked at Arthur, then at Miss Marple. No. The single word was barely audible. Crane noticed the exchange. What happened that day? Margaret shook her head. Nothing. Miss Marple spoke gently. Mrs. Wycliffe, people often say nothing happened when they mean they don't want to discuss what happened. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. Perhaps not. My mother made us promise. Promise what? Margaret looked toward the closed bedroom door. That we would never speak about Edward again. Arthur's face tightened. That is enough. No, Margaret whispered. It isn't? Everyone became silent. Margaret looked at Miss Marple. My mother was afraid. We know. No, she said. You don't, she took a breath. She wasn't afraid that Edward would come back. Miss Marple waited. She was afraid that he would come back and tell the truth. Arthur suddenly seized Margaret's arm. Stop! Margaret pulled away. You can't keep doing this. Doing what? Pretending nothing happened. Crane stepped between them. What happened 23 years ago? Arthur stared at the floor. Margaret whispered, The night Edward disappeared, there was another man in the house. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Who? Margaret opened her mouth. Before she could answer, a loud crash came from downstairs. Everyone froze. Crane drew his attention toward the hallway. Stay here. He hurried downstairs. Miss Marple followed. The front door was open. A vase had been knocked from the hallway table. Broken pieces lay across the floor, but there was no one there. Then Crane noticed the open study door. He entered. The room had been disturbed. Desk drawers stood open. Papers were scattered across the carpet. Miss Marple slowly walked toward the desk. Something caught her attention. A small patch of mud had been left on the polished floor. Beside it was a single thread of dark wool. She bent down without touching either. Crane examined the window. It came from outside. Miss Marple looked at the mud. No. What? She pointed toward the floor. The mud is on the inside. Crane stared. The window was locked. The door was open. Someone had entered the study from inside the house. But there was more. On the desk lay a small brass key, the same key Miss Marple had noticed on the mantelpiece the previous day. Only now it was wet. Crane picked it up carefully. Arthur said this belonged to Eleanor. Yes, he also said it opened nothing. Miss Marple looked at the key. Perhaps he was mistaken. Then she noticed something else. A faint mark had been scratched into the wooden desk. 3 letters. E.W. Crane. Frowned. Edward Wycliffe. Miss Marple shook her head. Perhaps. She looked toward the staircase. But there is another possibility. What? Miss Marple's voice remained quiet. Eleanor Wycliffe. Crane stared at her. You think she left the initials? I think we should not assume they belong to the person whose name comes most readily to mind." Before Crane could reply, a shout came from outside. They rushed into the garden. A constable stood near the hedge. "We found Mr. Daniel Wycliffe." Crane hurried toward him. "Where?" The constable pointed toward the old orchard. "He was hiding there." Daniel emerged slowly from between the trees. His coat was torn. His face was pale, and in his hand he held a small piece of paper. Crane took it from him. There were only 6 words written across it. "Ask your grandfather about the river." Miss Marple read the message. Then she looked at Daniel. For the first time, the young man's fear seemed greater than before. Because whatever had happened beside the river at 917, Daniel clearly knew more about it than he had admitted. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was becoming increasingly desperate to make certain that the truth stayed buried. Chapter 5. The Secret. By the River. Inspector Crane read the note for the 3rd time. "Ask your grandfather about the river." The words were written in dark ink on a torn piece of cream-colored paper. There was nothing else upon it, no signature, no date, no explanation. Daniel Wycliffe stood beneath the bare branches of the orchard, looking as though he regretted ever leaving his hiding place. "Where did you get this?" Crane asked. Daniel swallowed. "I found it." "Where?" "Near the river." Crane's eyes narrowed. "You were at the river?" "Yes." "At 9:17 last night?" Daniel looked toward Miss Marple. She said nothing. That seemed to make him more nervous. "I don't know what time it was." "You've been missing since this afternoon." I needed to think. "About what?" Daniel rubbed his hands together. "About my grandmother." Crane folded the note. "Your grandmother is dead." "I know." "And you believe someone killed her?" Daniel nodded. "Why?" "Because she told me she was frightened." "We've heard that before." Daniel looked at Miss Marple. "She told me something else." "What?" "She said my grandfather wasn't the man everyone believed him to be." The inspector frowned. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." "You expect me to believe that?" Daniel's voice suddenly sharpened. "I don't know what happened 23 years ago." Then he lowered his eyes. "But I know everyone has been lying about it." Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was something sincere in his distress, but sincerity, she knew, was not the same thing as innocence. People could tell the truth about one matter while concealing another. She had seen it countless times. "Daniel," she said gently, "why did you go to the river last night?" He hesitated. "My grandmother asked me to." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Before the funeral?" "Yes." "What did she ask you to do?" Daniel looked toward the house. "She gave me something." "What?" "A key." Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the brass key lying on the study desk. "The same key?" Daniel nodded. "She told me to take it to the old boathouse." "Why?" "She didn't say." "And did you?" "Yes." "What did you find?" Daniel's face became pale. "Nothing." Miss Marple noticed his answer. "Too quick. What did you expect to find?" Daniel looked away. "I don't know. Inspector Crane stepped closer. "Daniel," the young man sighed. "There was a box." "A box?" "Under the floorboards." Crane's expression changed. "What was inside?" "I didn't open it." "Why not?" "Because someone was there." The inspector became completely still. "Who?" "I couldn't see. Man or woman? I don't know." "Then how do you know someone was there?" "I heard footsteps." "Where?" "Behind the boathouse." "And what happened?" Daniel's voice dropped. "I ran." Miss Marple looked toward the river. "Did the person follow you?" "No." "Then why were you frightened?" Daniel did not answer. Miss Marple waited. Finally he said, "Because they called my name." A silence followed. The river moved slowly beyond the orchard, dark beneath the cloudy sky. Crane turned to the constable. "Search the boathouse." The constable hurried away. Miss Marple remained beside Daniel. "You said your grandmother gave you the key." "Yes." "Did she say where she had obtained it?" "No." "Did she tell you what it opened?" Daniel shook his head. "She only said that if I wanted to understand what happened 23 years ago, I should start with the river." Miss Marple glanced toward the Wycliffe house. "And then?" "She told me never to trust Arthur." Crane overheard the words. He turned sharply. "Your uncle?" Daniel nodded. "Why?" "I don't know." "But you believed her?" Daniel looked miserable. "She was my grandmother." That answer told Miss Marple very little. Family loyalty could be remarkably selective. A few minutes later the constable returned. "Inspector," Crane turned. "Well?" "We found the box." Daniel closed his eyes. "Where?" "Inside the boathouse." "Open it?" The constable shook his head. "Not yet." Crane walked toward the river. Miss Marple followed. The old boathouse stood at the water's edge, half hidden by overgrown reeds. Its wooden walls had faded almost silver with age. Inside, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. The constable pointed toward a loose plank. "There." Crane knelt. He lifted it carefully. Beneath the floor was a narrow cavity. Inside sat a small wooden box. It was covered with dust. Miss Marple noticed something immediately. "The dust has been disturbed." Crane looked at her. "Recently?" "Very recently." The inspector opened the box. Inside were several objects. A silver cigarette case, a woman's brooch, 2 old photographs, and a folded sheet of paper. Crane picked up the photographs. The first showed Edward and Eleanor Wycliffe standing beside the river. The second showed Arthur and Margaret as young adults. Miss Marple took the second photograph. There was something unusual about it. Arthur was smiling. Margaret was not. And behind them, half obscured by the doorway of the boathouse, stood another figure, a man. His face could not be seen clearly. "Do you recognize him?" Crane asked Daniel. Daniel stared at the photograph. "No." Miss Marple looked closer. "He is wearing a dark coat." Crane turned over the photograph. There was writing on the back. October 14th, the night everything changed. Crane looked at Daniel. "Your grandmother knew about this." Daniel nodded slowly. "What about the paper?" Crane unfolded it. His expression changed. It was a letter, not from Eleanor. Not from Edward, but from someone named Thomas Vale. Miss Marple recognized the name immediately. Thomas Vale? Crane looked at her. You know him? I remember him. From 23 years ago? Yes. Who was he? Miss Marple's expression became thoughtful. He was the village solicitor. Daniel looked confused. But he died. Yes, said Miss Marple. When? 23 years ago. The room became silent. Crane examined the letter. Then why is his letter here? Miss Marple did not answer. The paper was dated October 15th, 2003, one day after the date written on the photographs. The letter contained only a few lines. Crane read them aloud. Eleanor, I have kept my promise. The documents are safe. If Edward returns, you must tell him the truth before someone else pays the price. Daniel stared at him. What documents? Crane looked inside the box again. There were no documents. Only the cigarette case, brooch, photographs, and letter. Miss Marple reached for the brooch. It was small and silver, shaped like a forget-me-not. She turned it over. There were tiny initials engraved on the back. M.W. Margaret Wycliffe, Crane said. Miss Marple shook her head. Perhaps. Daniel looked at his mother's name. My mother never wore that. Crane looked at him. How do you know? Because she hates silver jewelry. Miss Marple placed the brooch back inside the box. Something about it bothered her. Not the initials, the fact that it was perfectly clean. Everything else in the box was dusty. The brooch had not been there long. Someone had placed it inside recently, perhaps yesterday, perhaps even today. She said nothing. Crane closed the box. We'll take this to the station. As they stepped outside, Daniel remained behind. Miss Marple looked back. He was staring at the river. What is it? She asked. Daniel pointed toward the opposite bank. There. Miss Marple followed his gaze. A figure stood among the trees, too far away to identify. The figure watched them, then turned and disappeared. Crane reached for his coat. Stay here. He hurried along the riverbank. Miss Marple watched until he vanished among the trees. Then she looked at Daniel. You've seen that person before? Daniel's face tightened. Yes? Who? I don't know. Miss Marple waited. After a long silence, Daniel finally whispered, But they were at my grandmother's funeral. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The stranger? Daniel shook his head. No. Then who? Daniel looked toward the village. My mother. For the first time that day, Miss Marple felt a genuine chill. Margaret Wycliffe had told them she was afraid of the past, but she had not told them why. And now her son's words suggested that Margaret had been hiding something much closer to home. As they walked back toward the house, Miss Marple noticed something lying beneath the hedge, a small piece of black wool, the same dark wool as the thread found in Eleanor's study. She did not pick it up. She merely looked at it. Then she smiled very faintly. Someone had made a mistake, a tiny one, the sort of mistake most people would never notice. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing such things, and she had begun to suspect that the real secret of the Wycliffe family was not who had returned from the dead, it was who had been pretending not to know him. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Knew Too Much. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had acquired another mystery. The box from the old boathouse had been taken to the police station. The note found in Daniel's possession had been placed in an evidence envelope, and Margaret Wycliffe had not slept. She sat alone in the breakfast room, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. For 23 years, she had believed that silence was the safest choice. Now she was beginning to wonder whether silence had merely given the past time to grow teeth. Across the table, Arthur stood beside the window. "You should not have spoken yesterday." Margaret did not look at him. "I said almost nothing." "You said enough. She is dead, Arthur." "I know. And Edward has returned." "I know that too." Margaret finally looked up. "Then why are you still pretending?" Arthur's face hardened. "Because there are things that must remain buried." Margaret stared at him. "That is exactly what Mother used to say." Arthur turned away. Neither noticed that someone was standing briefly outside the half-open door. Daniel. He had heard enough. He quietly walked away. At the police station, Inspector Crane examined the contents of the wooden box once again. The cigarette case belonged to Edward. The brooch had Margaret's initials. The photographs belonged to another time. And Thomas Vale's letter raised more questions than it answered. Miss Marple sat opposite him. "You've spoken to Edward?" "Yes." "And?" "He denies knowing anything about the box." "Do you believe him?" Crane sighed. "I don't know." Miss Marple looked at the cigarette case. "Does he admit this is his?" "Yes." "When did he last see it?" "He says 23 years ago." "Interesting." "What?" "The box was hidden yesterday." Crane looked at her. "How do you know?" "The brooch was clean." He nodded. "We found that." "And the cigarette case?" "Also clean." Miss Marple smiled. "Then perhaps the person who placed the objects there wanted them to be discovered." Crane leaned back. "You think the box was planted?" "I think someone wanted us to find it. That could mean almost anything." "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "But it tells us something important." "What?" "Someone knows what the police are looking for." Before Crane could reply, the door opened. A constable entered. "Inspector, Mrs. Finch has been found." Crane stood immediately. "Where?" "At the old chapel." Miss Marple's expression changed. "Is she alive?" "Yes." "Then we should go." The old chapel stood at the far edge of the village, surrounded by yew trees and an overgrown cemetery. Mrs. Finch was sitting on a stone bench inside. Her clothes were damp. Her face was pale, but she appeared unharmed. Crane approached carefully. "Mrs. Finch?" She looked at him. "I knew you'd come. Where have you been?" She hesitated. "Walking." "For how long?" "Since yesterday morning. You disappeared immediately after Mrs. Wycliffe's funeral." Mrs. Finch lowered her eyes. "I was frightened." "Of whom?" She looked toward Miss Marple. "Of everyone." Miss Marple sat beside her. "Mrs. Finch, you worked for Mrs. Wycliffe for many years." 16. "You knew her well." Yes. Did she seem frightened before her death? Mrs. Finch nodded. For several weeks. Why? I don't know. Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Finch's fingers tightened around the edge of her coat. She received letters. From whom? She never told me. Did she destroy them? No. Where did she keep them? Mrs. Finch hesitated. In a blue tin. Crane immediately took out his notebook. Where is the tin? Mrs. Finch looked toward the chapel door. I don't know. Was it in the house? Yes. Where? In the kitchen. Crane frowned. We searched the kitchen. Mrs. Finch looked surprised. Then someone must have moved it. Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands. Mrs. Finch, why did you leave? The woman took a long breath. Because I knew what was going to happen. What? I knew Mrs. Wycliffe would die. Crane became still. You knew she would be murdered? I knew someone meant to frighten her. That isn't the same thing. Mrs. Finch looked at him. No. Her voice became quieter. But I knew the person who frightened her. Who? Mrs. Finch shook her head. I can't say. Why not? Because they will kill me too. Miss Marple spoke softly. Did Mrs. Wycliffe know? Yes. Did she know who it was? Mrs. Finch looked down. Yes. Crane leaned forward. Then why didn't she tell the police? Mrs. Finch gave a sad smile. Because she believed the police would never understand. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Did she say that? She said, the truth isn't always what people want to hear. The words lingered in the cold chapel. Miss Marple remembered the photograph, the date, the message. The mysterious man in the doorway. Mrs. Finch, she asked, what happened on October 14th, 23 years ago? The woman's face changed. She looked genuinely frightened. You know about that? We know something happened. Mrs. Finch stood. I must go. Crane caught her arm gently. Not yet. She stared at him. You don't understand? Then help me understand. Mrs. Finch looked toward Miss Marple. The night Edward disappeared, she whispered. Mrs. Wycliffe came downstairs at midnight. What was she carrying? Mrs. Finch swallowed. A suitcase. Where was she going? I don't know. Who was with her? Mrs. Finch closed her eyes. No one. Miss Marple considered this. Are you certain? Yes. Then why did she have a suitcase? I don't know. And what happened afterward? Mrs. Finch looked at the floor. There was a knock at the door. Who was there? She did not answer. Crane's patience began to disappear. Mrs. Finch. Finally, she whispered a name. Thomas Vale. Crane frowned. The solicitor. Yes, but he died that same night. Mrs. Finch nodded. That is what everyone was told. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Was it true? Mrs. Finch looked at her. I don't know. That answer disturbed Miss Marple more than a definite yes would have done. Before Crane could continue, footsteps sounded outside the chapel. Everyone turned. Arthur Wycliffe stood in the doorway. His face was pale. Mrs. Finch, he said. The housekeeper immediately stepped backward. Arthur's eyes moved to Crane. My sister is looking for you. What does she want? I don't know. Then Arthur looked at Mrs. Finch. She wants to speak to you. Mrs. Finch shook her head. No. Arthur's expression hardened. You must. Miss Marple noticed the change. Not anger, fear. Arthur was afraid of Mrs. Finch. That was new and important. Crane stepped between them. No one is going anywhere until I say so. Arthur looked at him. Then he reached into his coat. Miss Marple watched his hand carefully. He removed a folded piece of paper. This was delivered to my house this morning. Crane took it. The paper contained one sentence. The woman who knows the truth will not survive another night. Mrs. Finch began to tremble. Daniel appeared behind Arthur. He had followed him. That's the same handwriting, Daniel said. Crane turned. What? The note I found near the river. Miss Marple looked from one paper to the other. The handwriting was indeed similar, but something bothered her. She studied the letters. The words were carefully formed, too carefully. Then she noticed a small detail. The writer had used the same unusual flourish on the letter T. A person who wrote both notes wanted them to appear connected. Perhaps they were, perhaps they were not. Miss Marple gently returned the paper to Crane. Inspector, yes? May I ask you something? Of course. Where did this letter arrive? At the Wycliffe house. Who found it? Arthur. Was anyone else there? No. Miss Marple looked at Arthur. Then perhaps we should ask a simpler question. Arthur frowned. What question? She smiled pleasantly. Who knew that Mrs. Finch had been found? Nobody answered. Miss Marple turned toward the chapel door. Because outside, in the muddy path, she could see fresh footprints. One set led toward the chapel. Another led away. The first belonged to the constable. The second was smaller, and whoever had made them had been standing just outside the door, listening. Someone had known exactly where Mrs. Finch would be. Someone had followed them there. Miss Marple quietly picked up her umbrella. The village was no longer merely hiding an old secret. It was protecting someone who was still actively working to keep that secret buried. And Miss Marple had begun to suspect that the person she needed to watch most carefully was not the returning husband. It was the person who had been afraid of his return all along. Chapter 7. The Missing Letter. The footprints outside the old chapel were gone by morning. Not washed away by rain, removed. Someone had deliberately disturbed the muddy path during the night. Inspector Crane stood beside the hedge, staring at the flattened earth. They knew we would look here. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Yes, and they wanted us to know they knew. Perhaps. Crane glanced at her. You always say perhaps. It prevents one from becoming too confident. The inspector gave a reluctant smile. Sometimes I think you enjoy making police work difficult. Oh, no, said Miss Marple. I merely dislike making it unnecessarily simple. They returned to the police station. Mrs. Finch had been taken there earlier that morning and was waiting in a small interview room. She looked exhausted. Crane placed the two threatening notes on the table. You recognize the handwriting? Mrs. Finch shook her head. No, Daniel does. I don't know anything about Daniel. He says the handwriting on his note is the same. Mrs. Finch looked genuinely confused. I never saw the boy's note. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was no hesitation in her answer, no guarded pause. She seemed to be telling the truth. Crane leaned back. Then, perhaps you can tell us about Thomas Vale. Mrs. Finch became very still. I already told you. You said he visited the Wycliffe house 23 years ago. Yes? You said he died that night. Yes? But you weren't certain. Mrs. Finch looked down. I wasn't there when he died. Then why did you believe he was dead? Because Mrs. Wycliffe told me. Miss Marple spoke softly. Did she ever say where his body was? Mrs. Finch shook her head. No. Did you see him leave the house? No. Did anyone? I don't know. Crane frowned. You worked there. I was only the housekeeper. Miss Marple smiled gently. People often underestimate housekeepers. Mrs. Finch looked at her. Mrs. Wycliffe used to say that. Did she? She said a housekeeper knows everything, because everyone forgets she is in the room. Miss Marple lowered her eyes. That sounds like Eleanor. For a moment, Mrs. Finch almost smiled. Then the expression vanished. She wasn't always cruel. No, she was frightened. Of Edward? Mrs. Finch shook her head. Of what she had done. Crane leaned forward. What had she done? Mrs. Finch looked toward the door. I can't tell you. You can. I promised. To whom? She hesitated. Mrs. Wycliffe. She is dead. Mrs. Finch's eyes filled with tears. I promised her before she died. Miss Marple remained silent. There was something about the way Mrs. Finch spoke those words that suggested the promise was not merely sentimental. It was a debt, and debts, Miss Marple knew, were often more powerful than affection. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the Wycliffe house. Margaret answered the door. You shouldn't have come. I'm sorry to hear that. Margaret looked nervous. Arthur isn't here. I wasn't looking for Arthur. Margaret stepped aside. Miss Marple entered. The house felt different. Too quiet. There was no sound from the kitchen. No ticking clock. No movement upstairs. Where is Daniel? Miss Marple asked. Margaret looked away. I don't know. Have you spoken to him? Not since yesterday. That is unusual. Margaret's expression tightened. You don't understand this family? Perhaps not. Miss Marple smiled. But I am trying. Margaret led her into the drawing room. Miss Marple sat near the window. I wanted to ask you about the photograph. Margaret stiffened. The one from October 14th. Yes. You shouldn't have it. Why? Because my mother hid it. That suggests it was important. Margaret looked toward the fireplace. She didn't want anyone to remember that day. Why? Because someone died. Miss Marple waited. Who? Margaret closed her eyes. Thomas Vale. But Mrs. Finch wasn't certain he died. She was wrong. How do you know? I saw him. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. When? That night. Margaret's voice trembled. He came to the house after midnight. What happened? He argued with my mother. About Edward? Yes. Did you hear what they said? Some of it. What did Thomas Vale want? Margaret looked at her. He wanted the truth. And your mother? She wanted him to leave. Did he? Margaret hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple studied her. Are you certain? Margaret's eyes moved toward the hallway. No. That single word carried more weight than anything she had said before. Miss Marple noticed a small blue tin sitting on the sideboard. She pointed toward it. What is that? Margaret turned. For a moment she looked startled. Then she walked over and picked it up. Nothing. Is that your mother's? Yes. May I see it? Margaret hesitated, then opened the lid. It was empty. Miss Marple looked inside. Where are the letters? Margaret's face went pale. What letters? Mrs. Finch told us about a blue tin. Margaret closed the lid immediately. She shouldn't have told you. Why? Because the letters are gone. When? I don't know. Who removed them? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. Miss Marple stood. Then perhaps we should ask a different question. Margaret looked at her. What? Who knew where the tin was kept? Margaret said nothing. Miss Marple smiled gently. Your mother? Yes. You? Yes. Arthur? I suppose. Daniel? I don't know. Miss Marple looked at the empty tin. That is interesting. What is? You said you didn't know whether Daniel knew about it. Margaret's expression changed, only slightly, but enough. Miss Marple understood. Daniel knew, and Margaret knew that he knew. Before either woman could say more, the front door opened. Arthur entered. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple. You again. I'm afraid so. Arthur looked at Margaret. We need to talk. About what? Edward. Margaret became pale. Miss Marple quietly moved toward the door. Arthur noticed. Where are you going? To give you privacy. No. The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple turned. Arthur's face was tense. I want you to stay. Why? Because you seem to know more than you admit. Miss Marple smiled. That is a very common village complaint. Arthur ignored the remark. He placed a folded letter on the table. This was delivered to me. Miss Marple looked at it. Another threat? No. What is it? Arthur opened the letter. It contained only one sentence. The missing letter is not missing. Ask Margaret where she put it. Margaret stared at the page. I didn't. Arthur turned toward her. You told me the letters were gone. They are. Then explain this. I can't. Miss Marple noticed something. The letter was written on thick cream paper, the same kind used for Eleanor's personal correspondence. She reached for it. Arthur hesitated, then allowed her to take it. Miss Marple examined the paper. No envelope? No. Where did you find it? Under my bedroom door. Was anyone in the house? Margaret. Margaret shook her head. I never saw it. Miss Marple turned the letter over. Nothing. Then she noticed a faint indentation near the bottom. Someone had pressed a word into the paper with a hard object. She tilted it toward the window. The light revealed the marks. 4 letters. Vale. Arthur stared. Thomas Vale. Margaret sat down. Miss Marple looked at her. Mrs. Wycliffe, You told me Thomas Vale came to the house that night. Yes. You said he left. Yes. But the letter suggests something remained behind. Margaret's voice was barely audible. The letter. Miss Marple nodded. Which letter? Margaret looked at Arthur, then toward the staircase. The one Thomas Vale gave my mother. What did it contain? I don't know. You saw it? Yes. Where is it now? Margaret closed her eyes. I hid it. Arthur stepped toward her. Where? She did not answer. Miss Marple intervened. Arthur. He stopped. Let her speak. Margaret finally looked up. I put it somewhere Mother would never search. Where? In the old church. Miss Marple frowned. Why? Because Mother was afraid of the church. That was unexpected. Why? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. Miss Marple looked toward the window. The church tower stood in the distance. Its clock had stopped. 9:17, exactly the same time as the watch found beside the river. She stared at it for several seconds. Then she turned back. Inspector Crane should search the church. Arthur's expression changed. Why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because if Thomas Vale's letter is still there, someone else may already be looking for it. And as if her words had summoned an answer, the church bell rang once, then stopped. A moment later, Daniel appeared at the garden gate. He was holding something tightly in his hand, a small blue envelope. He looked at Miss Marple. I found this in my mother's room. Margaret stood abruptly. Daniel, he shook his head. You should have told me. What? Daniel held up the envelope. This has Grandma's handwriting. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but she knew the investigation had just crossed an important threshold. The missing letter had been found, and whatever Eleanor Wycliffe had written 23 years ago might finally explain why one man disappeared, why another supposedly died, and why someone had been willing to kill to keep the past silent. Chapter 8. The Letter in the Blue Envelope. For several seconds, nobody in the Wycliffe garden moved. Daniel stood beneath the gray afternoon sky, holding the blue envelope as though it might burn his fingers. Margaret stared at it. Arthur looked away. Miss Marple noticed both reactions. Margaret's was fear. Arthur's was something different. Resignation. That distinction mattered. Where did you find it? Miss Marple asked. Daniel looked at his mother. In your bedroom. Margaret's face went white. I told you to stay out of my things. You told me not to ask questions. I was trying to protect you. From what? Margaret had no answer. Inspector Crane arrived several minutes later, having been summoned from the station. He examined the envelope without opening it. You said this has Mrs. Wycliffe's handwriting? Daniel nodded. I'm certain. Crane looked at Miss Marple. Do we open it here? No, she said. Why not? Because if it has survived for 23 years, I think we can afford another 10 minutes. Crane almost smiled. They returned to the drawing room. The curtains were drawn against the fading afternoon light. Daniel sat beside the fireplace. Margaret remained standing. Arthur paced slowly near the window. Miss Marple watched them all. The family reminded her of a teacup that had been dropped but not yet broken. Every piece was still in place, but the crack was visible. Crane carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet. The paper had yellowed with age. He unfolded it. Eleanor's handwriting covered both sides. Crane read silently. Then he looked up. This is dated October 15th, 23 years ago. Margaret closed her eyes. What does it say? Crane hesitated. Miss Marple held out her hand. May I? He passed it to her. Miss Marple read the letter slowly. The first lines were ordinary. Eleanor wrote that she had been frightened. She wrote that Thomas Vale had visited her. She wrote that Edward had disappeared. Then came the sentence that made Miss Marple stop. Edward did not leave willingly. Daniel stared at her. What does that mean? Miss Marple continued. The letter explained that Edward had discovered financial irregularities involving Thomas Vale. Money had disappeared from several accounts. Edward had threatened to expose the solicitor. Thomas Vale, terrified of disgrace, had confronted him. But the letter did not say what happened afterward. Instead, Eleanor wrote, there were 3 men at the river that night. Crane looked up. 3? Miss Marple nodded. The letter continued. 1 was Edward. 1 was Thomas Vale. The third name had been carefully scratched out. Daniel leaned forward. Who was the third man? Miss Marple studied the damaged paper. I don't know. Arthur suddenly spoke. I do. Everyone turned. Arthur looked exhausted. It was my father. Miss Marple frowned. Edward was one of the 3. No. Arthur shook his head. My father wasn't Edward. Silence. Daniel stared at him. What are you saying? Arthur's voice trembled. There were 2 men who came to the river that night. Margaret whispered, Arthur, stop. No. He turned toward her. We have lied long enough. Crane stepped forward. Then tell me what happened. Arthur looked at the letter. Edward discovered that Thomas Vale had been stealing money. From whom? From clients. And what did Edward do? He confronted him. What happened at the river? Arthur swallowed. My father went there to meet Vale. Miss Marple interrupted gently. Your father? Arthur nodded. Edward. Then why did you say Edward wasn't one of the 3? Because the man we saw at the river wasn't Edward. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Who was he? Arthur looked at Margaret. She whispered, Don't. But Arthur continued. Thomas Vale had hired someone. Who? I don't know. The room fell silent. Crane looked frustrated. You expect me to believe that 23 years ago your father disappeared, a solicitor died, and now you tell me there was another man involved? Arthur nodded. I saw him. When? That night. How old were you? 23. And Margaret? 20. Margaret looked down. Crane turned toward her. Is this true? She nodded. Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because Mother told us that if we spoke, Edward would be blamed. But he disappeared. We knew he wasn't dead. Miss Marple looked at her sharply. You knew? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. We saw him after the river. That was the first genuinely shocking statement either of them had made. Crane stepped closer. Where? At the old railway station? When? 2 days later. Was he alive? Yes. Then why did he disappear again? Margaret shook her head. We don't know. Miss Marple returned to the letter. There was another paragraph. She read it twice. Eleanor wrote that Edward left something behind. What? Daniel asked. I don't know. Miss Marple turned the page. There was a final line. The key will open the truth, but only when the clock stops. Everyone stared at one another. Crane immediately thought of the brass key. The one from the study. Miss Marple nodded. And the clock. Daniel looked toward the hallway. The church clock. Yes. Crane stood. Let's go. They hurried through the village toward St. Mary Mead Church. The sky had darkened. The churchyard was almost empty. The great wooden doors stood open. Inside, the church was cold and silent. The clock above the entrance had stopped. 9:17 again. Crane looked up. This can't be coincidence. No, Miss Marple said. She walked toward the old vestry. Margaret followed. Where did you hide the letter 23 years ago? Margaret stopped. I didn't. Daniel looked at her. You said you did. I said I hid it. Where? She pointed toward an old wooden cabinet. Miss Marple opened it. Nothing. Crane searched behind the shelves. Nothing. Then Miss Marple noticed a small indentation in the wood. She touched it. A hidden compartment opened. Inside was another envelope, older than the first, and sealed with dark red wax. Margaret covered her mouth. That wasn't there before. Miss Marple examined it. No. Crane reached for it. Before he could open it, footsteps echoed through the church. Everyone turned. A figure stood at the far end of the nave. It was too dark to identify. Stop! Crane shouted. The figure ran. Crane pursued. Arthur followed. Daniel remained beside Miss Marple. She did not move. She was looking at the envelope. There is something wrong, she murmured. Daniel stared at her. What? The wax. What about it? It is fresh. He looked confused, but the envelope is 23 years old. Exactly. Miss Marple turned it over. The seal had been placed recently. Someone had opened the original envelope and resealed it. She carefully examined the edges. Someone has read this. Who? Miss Marple looked toward the empty church. Someone who knew exactly where it was hidden. A moment later, Crane returned. He was breathing heavily. I lost him. Miss Marple nodded. I expected you might. Crane looked irritated. You expected it? I suspected the person wouldn't want to be caught. He looked at the envelope. What did you find? Miss Marple handed it to him. The truth, perhaps. Crane broke the seal. Inside was a single photograph. 3 men stood beside the river. One was Edward Wycliffe. One was Thomas Vale. The third man's face had been scratched away. But beneath the photograph was a handwritten name, Arthur Wycliffe. Arthur, standing behind them, suddenly went pale. No. Miss Marple looked at him. Arthur shook his head. I was not there. Miss Marple said nothing. because the photograph had already told her something far more important. The handwriting beneath it was not Eleanor's. It was written in a different hand, and she had seen that handwriting before. On the threatening note, someone had been rewriting the past, and they were still doing it. Chapter 9. The Final Test. Arthur Wycliffe remained beside the church pew, staring at the photograph. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The church seemed to have grown colder. Inspector Crane held the photograph beneath the dim light, examining the three figures beside the river: Edward, Thomas Vale, and the third man whose face had been deliberately scratched away. Beneath them, the name Arthur Wycliffe had been written in unfamiliar handwriting. Arthur shook his head. "I wasn't there." Crane looked at him. "Then why is your name underneath the photograph?" "I don't know." "You expect me to believe that?" Arthur's voice rose. "Yes, because it is the truth." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was fear in his face, but fear was not proof of guilt. A frightened, innocent person and a frightened murderer could look remarkably similar. The difference was usually found somewhere else, in what they noticed, in what they forgot, in what they were afraid someone else might mention. Miss Marple looked at the photograph again. "Inspector." "Yes?" "May I see the other side?" Crane turned it over. There was nothing written there. "Interesting," she murmured. "What?" "The photograph was handled recently." Crane frowned. "How can you tell?" "The edges are cleaner than the center." He looked at her. "You think someone has been holding it?" "Yes." "Recently?" "Very." Arthur stared at the photograph, but it was inside the hidden compartment. Miss Marple nodded. "Which means someone opened that compartment before us." Margaret suddenly spoke. "Mother." Everyone turned. Margaret's voice was trembling. "My mother must have opened it." 23 years ago?" Crane asked. "No." Margaret shook her head. "Recently." Miss Marple studied her. "Why do you say that?" "Because Mother used to hide things there." "What things?" "Letters? Jewelry? Money?" "Did she know about the photograph?" "I don't know." Margaret looked toward Arthur. "But she knew the compartment existed." Miss Marple remained silent. Something was troubling her. The photograph, the fresh wax, the threatening notes, the muddy footprint, all of them appeared connected. Yet the connection was almost too neat. Someone was leaving clues, not accidentally, deliberately, and deliberate clues could be lies. Crane folded the photograph carefully. "We need to speak to Edward." They returned to the Crown Hotel. Edward was sitting exactly where they had left him. He looked at their faces. "You found something." Crane placed the photograph on the table. Edward looked at it. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you get this?" "In the church." Edward picked it up. His hands trembled. "I haven't seen this in 23 years. Miss Marple watched him. "Who is the third man?" Edward looked at her. "I don't know." "Was he at the river?" "Yes." "Who was he?" "I never learned his name." "Did Arthur know him?" Edward stared at the photograph. "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Then why was Arthur's name written beneath it?" Edward's face became grim. Because someone wants you to believe Arthur was involved. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps. Edward looked at Crane. Where is my son? At the Wycliffe house. Is he safe? For now. Edward stood. I need to see him. Crane stopped him. Not yet. Edward's expression hardened. You have no right. I have every right. You've treated me like a suspect since I arrived. You are a suspect. Edward looked at Miss Marple. And you? I am only curious. Edward almost smiled. That may be more dangerous. Miss Marple's expression remained pleasant. Sometimes, Crane placed the threatening note on the table. Do you recognize this handwriting? Edward looked at it. No. Are you certain? Yes. Miss Marple noticed his eyes lingered on one particular letter. The capital T. The same unusual flourish she had noticed before. She said nothing. Instead, she asked a different question. Mr. Wycliffe, what did Eleanor write in the letter she sent you? Edward looked at her. I told you. She was frightened. Yes, she said someone had discovered the truth. Yes? What truth? Edward hesitated. The truth about the river. Miss Marple nodded. And what happened at the river? Edward sat down. Thomas Vale died. Did you kill him? No. Did you see him die? Edward looked toward the window. Yes. Crane leaned forward. How? Thomas was arguing with someone. Who? I don't know. You expect us to believe you couldn't identify the man? It was dark. Miss Marple watched him. Was Arthur there? No. Margaret? No. Eleanor? Edward hesitated. Yes. That was new. Crane stared at him. You said your wife wasn't there. I never said that. You implied it. Edward shook his head. I said I hadn't seen her. Miss Marple noticed the distinction, very carefully chosen. Where was Eleanor? At the edge of the river. Did she speak to you? Yes. What did she say? Edward's expression became distant. She told me to run. Why? She said someone had seen me. Who? I don't know. Did you run? Yes. And then I left St. Mary Mead. For 23 years? Edward nodded. Why didn't you return? Because Eleanor asked me not to. Miss Marple was quiet. That answer troubled her. Not because it was unbelievable, because it was incomplete. She decided it was time to test something. Mr. Wycliffe, she said gently, I think I know who killed Eleanor. Edward stared at her. Crane turned sharply. Miss Marple continued, I believe it was someone who attended the funeral. Edward's face remained still. Who? Miss Marple smiled. I cannot tell you yet. Edward's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Then why say it? To see what you would ask. He stared at her. Miss Marple continued, You didn't ask whether the murderer was a man or woman. Edward said nothing. You asked who. She paused. That suggests you already suspect someone. Edward looked away. Miss Marple noticed. The reaction was small, but it was enough. She did not press him further. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Margaret alone. The younger woman opened the door with obvious reluctance. Is something wrong? Perhaps Miss Marple entered. I wanted to ask you one last question. Margaret sighed. What? Where were you at 9:17? Margaret froze. Miss Marple watched her. The watch, Margaret whispered. Yes, I was at home. Alone? Yes. Are you certain? Margaret looked toward the staircase. Yes, Miss Marple smiled. Thank you. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Margaret looked at her. Did Arthur know where you were? Margaret hesitated. No. Miss Marple nodded. That's interesting. When she stepped outside, she found Inspector Crane waiting. I've discovered something, he said. What? The watch. Yes? It doesn't belong to Edward. Miss Marple waited. It belongs to Thomas Vale. She looked at him. Then, it wasn't stopped beside the river 23 years ago. No. Crane's face was grim. It was stopped yesterday. Miss Marple looked toward the Wycliffe house. Then someone has been using the past to disguise something that happened in the present. Crane nodded. And I think we have another problem. What? The person who wrote the threatening notes has disappeared. Who? Margaret Wycliffe. Miss Marple's expression changed. For the first time, she felt certain that the killer was preparing the final move. But there was one question still unanswered. Why had the murderer brought Edward Wycliffe back to St. Mary Mead? Unless Edward had not been brought back, he had been summoned, and someone had known exactly what he would do when he received Eleanor's letter. Miss Marple looked toward the darkened village. Inspector, she said quietly, tomorrow we must ask everyone one question. What question? Who knew Eleanor was going to die? And somewhere beyond the churchyard, a door closed softly. Final chapter. The Truth Beneath the Bell. By 8 o'clock the next morning, St. Mary Mead had become a village holding its breath. Margaret Wycliffe was still missing. Inspector Crane had sent constables along the river, through the churchyard, and toward the railway station. Every path out of the village was being watched. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly calm. She sat in the Bluebell tea room with a cup of tea before her. The trouble with mysteries, she said quietly, is that people often look for the most dramatic explanation. Crane sat opposite her. And you don't? No. I look for the explanation that requires the fewest lies. He sighed. What have we missed? Miss Marple placed her teaspoon carefully beside the saucer. Perhaps nothing. That doesn't sound reassuring. It wasn't intended to. She looked toward the window. Inspector, you said the watch belonged to Thomas Vale. Yes. And it was stopped yesterday at 9:17. Yes, yet Thomas Vale supposedly died 23 years ago. Correct? Then someone wanted us to believe that something connected with Thomas happened yesterday. Crane nodded slowly. But why? To make us look backward. He stared at her. While something else was happening in the present. Exactly. Miss Marple rose. Let us go to the church. They found Edward Wycliffe waiting outside. He looked exhausted. You found Margaret? No, Crane replied. Edward's face tightened. She wouldn't disappear without a reason. Miss Marple studied him. "Mr. Wycliffe, did Eleanor ever tell you why she wanted you to return?" Edward was silent for several seconds. Then he reached into his coat. He produced a small folded paper. "I found this in my room last night. Crane took it. There were only 3 words. Come to the bell." Miss Marple looked toward the church tower. Interesting. They entered the church. The old bell rope hung beside the narrow staircase. Miss Marple stopped beneath it. The clock. Crane looked upward. "It still says 9:17. "Yes." Edward frowned. "That clock stopped 23 years ago." Crane turned. "What?" Edward stared at the clock. "I remember it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Then why did you think the watch stopped yesterday?" Edward looked confused. "I didn't know." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There we are." She walked toward the vestry. Behind an old wooden cabinet was a narrow door. Crane opened it. Inside was a small stone staircase leading upward. At the top they found Margaret. She was sitting beside the bell mechanism, pale but unharmed. Arthur was standing several feet away. "Arthur?" Crane said sharply. Arthur turned. "I found her here." Margaret looked at Miss Marple. "I came because I received another note." "What did it say?" Margaret handed it over. "You know what happened. Tell them before the bell rings." Miss Marple read it carefully. Then she smiled. "The final performance." Crane frowned. "What?" "The murderer has been arranging scenes for us from the beginning." She turned toward Arthur. "Isn't that right?" Arthur stared at her. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "You do." Arthur's face changed. Crane immediately stepped forward. "Arthur Wycliffe, I am going to ask you a few questions." "No." Arthur backed away. "I didn't kill my mother." Miss Marple nodded. "No, you didn't." Everyone became still. Crane looked at her. "Then who did?" Miss Marple turned toward Margaret. "Your mother was poisoned after drinking her evening tea." Margaret nodded. "Mrs. Finch prepared it." "But Mrs. Finch did not poison it," Miss Marple continued. "She left the kitchen before Eleanor drank it." Crane looked surprised. "Then who?" "The person who knew exactly when Eleanor would take her tea," Arthur whispered. "Daniel." Miss Marple shook her head. "No." Daniel appeared at the staircase. He had followed them into the church. Miss Marple looked at him. "You were frightened because you knew your grandmother had discovered something." Daniel lowered his head. "But you did not kill her." He nodded. "I only took the key." Miss Marple turned back to Arthur. "The murderer needed 3 things." She raised one finger. "First, access to Eleanor's tea. A second. Second, knowledge of the old family secret. A third. And finally, the ability to manipulate everyone else into suspecting Edward." Arthur's face had become completely white. Miss Marple continued. "The letters were planted. The photograph was altered. The watch was moved. Even the threatening notes were designed to point backward." Crane stared at Arthur. "But why?" Miss Marple looked at the church clock. "Because the truth about Thomas Vale was never what the village believed." She turned to Edward. "Mr. Wycliffe, you did not kill Thomas Vale." "No, you discovered that he was stealing money." "Yes." You confronted him at the river. Yes, but you did not know that someone else had followed you. Edward's expression changed. Miss Marple looked at Arthur. Your mother did. Arthur said nothing. 23 years ago, Eleanor saw what happened at the river. Thomas Vale was attacked, but he survived. He threatened to expose the person responsible. Crane frowned. Who? Miss Marple answered quietly. Arthur. Margaret covered her mouth. Arthur shook his head. No, Miss Marple continued. You were young. You were desperate. You had discovered that Vale was stealing money, and you feared that the scandal would destroy your family. You confronted him. I didn't kill him. No, said Miss Marple. You didn't. Arthur stared at her. You struck him. He fell. Eleanor arrived afterward. Margaret whispered. Mother knew. Yes, Miss Marple nodded. Eleanor helped conceal what happened. Thomas Vale eventually died from his injuries, and Edward was made to appear responsible. Edward closed his eyes. That is why she wanted me to return. Yes, she wanted to confess. She did. Arthur's voice broke. She was going to destroy everything. Miss Marple looked at him sadly. And so, 23 years later, you stopped her. Arthur lowered his head. The silence in the bell tower became absolute. Crane stepped toward him. You poisoned your mother. Arthur did not answer. That was enough. Miss Marple looked at the others. Mrs. Finch suspected the truth. Margaret knew part of it. Daniel discovered pieces of it. Edward was summoned back by Eleanor's letter. She paused. And Arthur knew that once Edward returned, the old secret would finally be exposed. Arthur whispered, I only wanted to protect the family. Miss Marple's expression softened. People often say that when they mean they want to protect themselves. Arthur looked at her. Then why all the clues? Because you needed someone else to appear guilty. She pointed toward the photograph. You scratched out the third man's face, then toward the threatening notes. You copied the handwriting. Then the watch. You placed Thomas Vale's old watch beside the river. And the key? Your mother had kept it for years. You used it because you knew Daniel would follow the instructions. Crane looked at Arthur. And the person seen outside the church? Arthur said nothing. Miss Marple answered for him. You. Arthur finally broke. He sat heavily on the stone step. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Outside, the village bells began to ring. This time, the clock moved. 9:18, then 9:19. The past had finally stopped repeating itself. Later that afternoon, St. Mary Mead returned to its familiar routines. The bakery opened. The post arrived. Mrs. Bell told 3 different versions of the story before tea. Mrs. Finch returned to the Wycliffe house, though she insisted she would never again work there. Edward remained in the village for several days. He stood beside Eleanor's grave alone. Margaret joined him. I am sorry, she said. Edward looked at the grave. So am I. Daniel stood farther away, watching them. For the first time, there was no secret between them that had to be carried in silence. Miss Marple watched from the church path. Inspector Crane joined her. You solved it. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, no. He raised an eyebrow. The clues solved it. I merely listened to them. He looked toward the Wycliffe family. You knew Arthur was guilty before the end. I suspected him. When? Miss Marple considered the question. When he told me the brass key opened nothing. Crane frowned. That was enough? No, she smiled. It was the way he said it. She adjusted her gloves. People rarely lie about objects. They lie about why the objects matter. Crane laughed softly. And now? Miss Marple looked across the peaceful village. Now everyone will go back to pretending that St. Mary Mead is an ordinary little place. Isn't it? Oh, certainly. She picked up her umbrella. Until the next funeral. Then she walked slowly toward home, leaving the churchyard behind. The bells continued to ring, and for the first time in 23 years, there was no extra mourner standing among the graves.